The morning sun cast long shadows across the alien landscape as Captain Sarah Chen pulled her A-10 Thunderbolt II into a steep dive. Below her, the purple-tinged mountains of Kepler 442b stretched endlessly, their crystalline peaks catching the light of the distant star. 3 months into humanity's first interstellar conflict, and the Zephyrian Empire still underestimated what humans could do with outdated equipment. Warthog lead. "This is tower control," crackled through her headset. "We've got multiple Zephyrian interceptors inbound to your position. Recommend immediate withdrawal." Sarah glanced at her tactical display. 12 red dots were converging on her location, their sleek dart-shaped fighters moving with the fluid grace that had made the Zephyrian military famous across 3 star systems. Each one was worth 10 times what her beat-up A-10 cost. Packed with technology that could dance circles around anything in Earth's arsenal. "Negative. Tower, I've got a job to finish," she replied, adjusting her approach toward the Zephyrian supply depot nestled in the valley below. The depot was feeding their advance forces, the same forces that had been pushing human colonists off their hard-won settlements for weeks. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, pulled up alongside her in his own A-10. The 2 aircraft looked like flying tanks compared to the elegant alien craft approaching them. All angles and armor plating where the Zephyrians favored smooth curves and energy shielding. "Sarah, we're outnumbered 6-1, Marcus said over the comm. "These aren't the mining drones we've been picking off. These are their actual military." The Zephyrians had been caught off guard when humans first arrived in their space. They'd expected the usual pattern. New species discovers faster than light travel, gets absorbed into the Empire, provides tribute and resources. What they hadn't expected was for humans to shoot back. Sarah's targeting computer locked onto the main power generator of the depot. The 30mm Ju-8 cannon, lovingly nicknamed the Angry Telephone Pole by A-10 pilots, was designed to punch through tank armor. She had no idea how it would handle Zephyrian shielding, but she was about to find out. "Warthog 2, take the secondary targets. I'll handle the main generator," she ordered, beginning her attack run. The first Zephyrian interceptor appeared on her 6, its pilot no doubt wondering what these primitive aircraft thought they were doing. Energy bolts, brilliant blue and hot enough to melt steel, began streaking past her cockpit. The shots were precise, calculated. Exactly what you'd expect from a species that had perfected warfare over centuries. What the Zephyrian pilot hadn't calculated was human stubbornness. Sarah held her dive, ignoring the proximity alarms as energy blasts scorched the air around her. The depot grew larger in her crosshairs, just a little closer. The Zephyrians had shields, advanced targeting systems, faster ships, but they'd never faced anyone crazy enough to fly straight into hell for a mission. "Sarah, you've got 3 more on your tail," Marcus called out, his own plane weaving between energy blasts as he lined up his shot. The lead Zephyrian pilot must have realized what she was planning, because the energy fire intensified. 1 bolt clipped her left wing, sending sparks cascading through the cockpit. Warning lights lit up her instrument panel like a Christmas tree, but the old Warthog kept flying. That was the beauty of the A-10. It was built to take damage and keep going. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds downrange at 3,900 rounds per minute. The sound was like the world's angriest chainsaw, a deep brrr that could be heard for miles. The rounds struck the power generator's shielding, which flared brilliant white before suddenly failing. The remaining rounds tore through the generator like tissue paper. The explosion that followed lit up the valley, a pillar of fire that reached toward the alien sky. Secondary explosions rippled through the depot as stored ammunition and fuel went up in a chain reaction that would have made any human demolitions expert proud. "Splash 1 depot," Sarah reported, pulling out of her dive as debris rained down around her. Behind her, the Zephyrian pilots had stopped firing. Their elegant interceptors hung in the air, motionless, as their pilots tried to process what they'd just witnessed. These humans had flown directly into concentrated fire from superior forces to complete their mission. It wasn't logical. It wasn't efficient. It was absolutely terrifying. Sarah looked back at the burning remains of the depot, then at the alien fighters that seemed frozen in space. She keyed her radio to the general frequency, knowing the Zephyrians would be listening. "This is Captain Sarah Chen, Earth Colonial Defense Force. You just learned lesson 1 about humans. We don't know when to quit." She banked toward home, Marcus forming up on her wing. Below them, the depot continued to burn, sending a black pillar of smoke into the alien sky like a monument to human determination. The real war was just beginning. 3 days after the depot raid, Captain Sarah Chen found herself in the briefing room of Forward Operating Base Cerberus, staring at holographic displays that showed Zephyrian fleet movements across the system. The alien formations were different now, more cautious, with fighter escorts shadowing their supply convoys where before they'd operated with casual confidence. Commander Elizabeth Hayes, the base's commanding officer, gestured to the tactical display. Intelligence reports the Zephyrians are calling you the Mad Flyer in their communications. Apparently your little stunt has them spooked. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Spooked enough to retreat? Not quite, but they're adapting faster than we hoped. Look at this. Hayes highlighted a section of the display showing a massive Zephyrian battle group moving toward the outer colonies. They're bringing in their heavy hitters, Dreadnought-class vessels, each one capable of glassing a planet from orbit. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The Zephyrians had decided humans were enough of a threat to warrant serious attention. Lieutenant Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair. So what's the plan? We can't exactly take on a dreadnought with A-10s. Hayes smiled grimly. Actually, that's exactly what we're going to do. Intel has identified a weakness in their fleet formation. The dreadnoughts rely on smaller escort vessels for point defense against fighters. Take out the escorts and those big ships become vulnerable. Sarah studied the formation data. The Zephyrians arranged their fleets like perfect geometric patterns, each ship positioned with mathematical precision to provide overlapping fields of fire. It was beautiful, efficient, and completely predictable to anyone willing to study it long enough. There's something else, Hayes continued. We've been monitoring Zephyrian military communications. Their pilots are requesting transfers away from sectors where human fighters operate. Apparently, our primitive tactics are causing psychological stress among their crews. The concept seemed alien itself. The Zephyrians were known across the galaxy for their disciplined military, their perfectly coordinated fleets that moved like clockwork. The idea that a handful of human pilots and outdated aircraft could rattle them was almost absurd. They fight like machines, explained Dr. Janet Price, the base's xenopsychologist. Perfect coordination, optimal tactics, minimal risk. They've been doing it the same way for centuries because it works. Then humans show up and completely ignore the rules of engagement. Sarah thought about her attack on the depot, flying straight through enemy fire because the mission required it. In Zephyrian military doctrine, such an action would be classified as suicide, not tactics. They can't adapt to unpredictability, Price continued. Their entire military structure is built on the premise that warfare follows logical patterns. When faced with opponents who make seemingly irrational decisions that actually work, they don't know how to respond. Hayes activated another display, showing the planned attack route. The dreadnought will be here in 18 hours, escorted by a full battle group. Our job is to punch through their fighter screen and take out their point defense systems. The fleet will handle the rest. Sarah traced the attack vector with her finger. It would require flying through the heart of the Zephyrian formation, past dozens of enemy fighters to reach the escort cruisers. The energy output from that many alien weapons would turn space into a light show that could be seen from orbit. Ma'am, with respect, this looks like a suicide mission, Rodriguez said. Only if you think like a Zephyrian, Hayes replied. They see the overwhelming odds and calculate defeat. But humans have a tendency to find ways to win even when logic says we shouldn't. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from weapon loadouts to emergency extraction protocols. But Sarah's mind kept drifting to something her grandfather had told her about his service in Earth's last global conflict. He'd been a tank commander, facing superior German equipment with machines that were slower, less sophisticated, but crewed by people who refused to give up. The thing about superior technology, he'd said, is that it makes you overconfident. You start believing your equipment makes you invincible. That's when someone with inferior gear and superior determination teaches you otherwise. After the briefing, Sarah walked out to the flight line where her A-10 sat in its hardened shelter. The ground crew had patched the wing damage from the depot raid, but scorch marks from the energy bolts still decorated the fuselage like battle scars. She ran her hand along the rough skin of the aircraft, feeling the rivets and seams that held it together. The Warthog wasn't pretty. It wasn't fast or particularly maneuverable compared to modern fighters, but it was tough, reliable and designed by people who understood that wars weren't won by the most advanced technology, but by the side willing to keep fighting when everything went wrong. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos approached with a clipboard, her maintenance crew working behind her to load fresh ammunition into the GAU-8. "She's ready for another round, Captain. Though I'd appreciate it if you'd avoid flying through quite so much enemy fire next time." Sarah grinned. "I'll see what I can do, Chief, but you know how it is with the Zephyrians. They just don't seem to understand that we're supposed to run away." Santos chuckled. "Maybe that's because nobody told us we were supposed to lose." As the alien sun set over the base, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sarah looked up at the stars where somewhere a Zephyrian dreadnought was bearing down on human space. Tomorrow she'd climb into her aging fighter and fly directly into the teeth of an enemy fleet that outgunned her by orders of magnitude. She couldn't wait. The attack began at dawn, with Sarah leading a formation of 12 A-10 Thunderbolts toward the approaching Zephyrian battle group. The alien fleet hung in space like a collection of jewels, their ships gleaming silver against the star field. At the center, the dreadnought dominated everything around it, a kilometer-long vessel bristling with enough firepower to reduce a moon to asteroids. "Warthog lead." "This is Fleet Command," came the voice of Admiral Torres over the comm. "We're tracking 48 enemy fighters moving to intercept." "You sure about this approach?" Sarah checked her tactical display. The Zephyrian interceptors were arranging themselves in perfect formation, creating overlapping kill zones that would trap any attacking force in a crossfire. It was textbook fleet defense, probably taught in their military academies for generations. "Confirmed, Fleet Command." "We're going with Plan Delta," she replied, then switched to her squadron frequency. "All right, Warthogs, you know the drill. We're going to do something these aliens have never seen before." Plan Delta was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Instead of approaching in formation like civilized pilots, the A-10s would scatter into individual attack vectors, each pilot improvising their route based on enemy reactions. No coordination, no predetermined patterns, just 12 human pilots making it up as they went along. To a Zephyrian tactical computer, it would look like chaos. Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. "Sarah, their fighters are adjusting to intercept. They're trying to predict our approach vectors. That's the beauty of it, Marcus. There's nothing to predict." Sarah threw her Warthog into a sudden dive, angling toward the underside of the formation where the escorts clustered around the dreadnought's belly. "Scatter pattern, people. Show them what human unpredictability looks like." The squadron broke apart like a flock of birds startled by a predator. Each A-10 chose its own path through the enemy formation, weaving between energy blasts and incoming missiles with moves that defied standard fighter doctrine. Where Zephyrian pilots flew with geometric precision, the humans barnstormed through space like crop dusters, all instinct and improvisation. Sarah rolled her aircraft inverted and pulled into a climbing turn that would have been impossible for most fighters to follow. The Zephyrian interceptor on her tail tried to match the maneuver, but its pilot was thinking 3 moves ahead, calculating optimal firing solutions while Sarah was just reacting to whatever felt right in the moment. The alien pilot's precision worked against him. While he was computing the perfect intercept course, Sarah had already changed direction twice, putting her inside his turning radius where his weapons couldn't track. "Warthog 6. I've got 3 on my tail," called Captain Lisa Park, her voice tight with concentration. "Negative." "Warthog 6, you've got 3 behind you." "I've got 3 on my tail," came the reply from Lieutenant Tom Bishop, his A-10 corkscrewing through a cloud of energy bolts that lit up the darkness like a deadly fireworks display. The distinction mattered. Zephyrian tactics emphasized pursuit and elimination of threats. But human pilots had learned to use the enemy's superior numbers against them, weaving through the formation until alien fighters were shooting at targets with their own ships in the background. Sarah lined up her first target, a sleek escort cruiser that was coordinating point defense for the dreadnought. The ship's shield shimmered like soap bubbles designed to deflect energy weapons and guided missiles. But shields had limitations, especially when faced with kinetic projectiles moving at high velocity. She triggered the GAU-8, and 30mm rounds streaked toward the cruiser at nearly a kilometer per second. The shield flared white, then blue, then failed catastrophically as more rounds than it could deflect punched through. The remaining ammunition tore into the ship's hull, setting off secondary explosions that rippled along its length. Splash 1 escort. Sarah reported, already turning toward her next target. Around her, the battle had devolved into something that would have given Zephyrian strategists nightmares. Human fighters were everywhere and nowhere, appearing out of unexpected angles to strafe escort ships before vanishing into the chaos. The aliens' perfect formation was coming apart as ships maneuvered to avoid friendly fire incidents. "This is Warthog 9. There, fighters are pulling back," called Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes. "I think we're confusing them." Sarah could see it too. The Zephyrian interceptors were clustering together, trying to re-establish formation flying while human fighters danced between them like gnats around a giant. The alien pilots were trained for fleet actions where everyone followed the plan, not this kind of individual free-for-all. She keyed her radio to the general frequency again, knowing the Zephyrians would be monitoring. "Attention, Zephyrian fleet. This is Captain Sarah Chen. You wanted to see how humans fight? This is Lesson 2. We don't have formations because we don't need them." The Dreadnought's massive guns were beginning to track toward the human fighters, but the ship's targeting computers were having trouble locking onto targets that refused to fly in predictable patterns. Energy beams swept through space where A-10s had been moments before, always a step behind pilots who changed direction based on gut instinct rather than tactical doctrine. "Warthog lead. Be advised we're seeing massive reinforcements inbound," called Fleet Command. "Estimate 60 additional fighters ETA 10 minutes. Sarah smiled grimly. The Zephyrians were doubling down, bringing in more ships to restore order to a battle that had spiraled completely out of their control. They still thought this was a problem that could be solved with superior numbers and coordination. They were about to learn otherwise. "Copy that, Fleet Command. Tell the fleet to move in. We'll keep the welcoming committee busy." She rolled into another attack run, this time targeting the Dreadnought's main sensor array. If they could blind the massive ship, it would become even more vulnerable to the fleet's heavy weapons. Behind her, 11 other A-10 pilots continued their chaotic dance through the enemy formation, each one writing their own rules for how to fight in space. The Zephyrians had brought their best ships, their most experienced pilots, their most advanced technology. But they'd never faced humans who simply refused to fight by anyone else's rules. The reinforcements arrived exactly on schedule, 60 fresh Zephyrian interceptors dropping out of hyperspace in perfect diamond formations. Sarah watched them deploy on her tactical display, their movements precise and coordinated as they moved to envelope the scattered human fighters. "Well, that's not good," muttered Lieutenant Rodriguez over the comm. His A-10 was trailing smoke from a glancing energy bolt, but still flying and fighting. Sarah had to admit the situation looked grim from a tactical standpoint. 72 enemy fighters against 12 humans, with more alien ships arriving every minute. Any reasonable military commander would order a withdrawal. But Sarah had stopped thinking like a reasonable military commander the moment she'd decided to fly A-10s against an interstellar empire. "All Warthogs, this is lead. New plan. We're going to do something so completely insane that their computers won't be able to process it." She banked hard toward the center of the Zephyrian formation, directly toward the Dreadnought that was now tracking her with weapons that could vaporize her fighter in a single shot. "Sarah, please tell me you're not about to do what I think you're about to do," Rodriguez called out. "I'm going to ram the Dreadnought's bridge," she replied calmly, as if discussing the weather. The tactical frequency exploded with voices. Her own pilots, Fleet Command, even some of the Zephyrian communications that had been automatically translated by the ship's computers. The universal consensus seemed to be that she'd finally lost her mind. But Sarah understood something that the aliens didn't. Humans had a long history of using seemingly suicidal tactics to achieve impossible victories, from ancient warriors charging superior forces to pilots diving their aircraft into enemy ships. Sometimes the threat of mutually assured destruction was the most powerful weapon in the arsenal. "Warthog lead. Negative on that approach." Admiral Torres's voice cut through the chatter. "You're too valuable to waste on a kamikaze run." "Not kamikaze, Admiral. Psychological warfare," Sarah replied, pushing her throttles forward. The A-10's engine screamed as she accelerated toward the Dreadnought's bridge tower, a massive structure that rose from the ship's hull like a crystalline mountain. She could see the Zephyrian interceptors converging on her position, their pilots probably screaming orders at each other as they tried to stop what appeared to be a mad woman in an obsolete fighter. Energy bolts filled the space around her, so dense that her cockpit strobed with reflected light. But something interesting was happening. The dreadnought's main guns, which had been firing at other targets, suddenly swung toward her. The massive ship was turning, trying to bring its defensive weapons to bear on a single fighter that posed no real threat to its armored hull. "She's actually doing it," breathed Lieutenant Park over the radio. "She's making a kilometer-long warship flinch." The Zephyrian formation was collapsing inward as every fighter tried to intercept Sarah's apparent suicide run. Ships that had been positioned to provide overlapping coverage were now clustering around their flagship, leaving gaps in their defensive grid that the other human pilots exploited ruthlessly. Sarah held her course until the dreadnought's bridge filled her entire field of view. She could see figures moving behind the transparent aluminum windows, Zephyrian officers pointing and gesturing in what she imagined was considerable panic. At the last possible second, she pulled into a vertical climb that took her over the bridge tower with meters to spare. The psychological impact was immediate. The dreadnought's captain, faced with what appeared to be a human pilot willing to try to destroy his ship, ordered all available weapons to target Sarah's fighter. Massive energy cannons that were designed to engage other capital ships swiveled to track a single A-10, their targeting computers struggling to lock onto something so small and agile. "All warthogs, the big fish, is distracted. Light up those escort cruisers," Sarah ordered, rolling into a dive that took her along the dreadnought's hull. The effect rippled through the entire Zephyrian formation. If one human pilot was willing to ram their flagship, what were the other 11 planning? Alien fighters broke off their coordinated attacks to form defensive screens around high-value targets. Abandoning offensive operations in favor of protection, Sarah's wingmen struck like a pack of wolves, their GAU-8 cannons tearing through escort ships whose shields had been configured to stop energy weapons, not kinetic projectiles. Within minutes, 3 more cruisers were drifting hulks, their point defense systems offline. "This is impossible," came a translated Zephyrian transmission. "Their tactical patterns make no sense. How do we counter an enemy that doesn't follow logical doctrine?" Sarah keyed her radio to the alien frequency. "You can't counter us because you're trying to fight the wrong war. You brought mathematics to a street fight." She pulled into another attack run, this time targeting the dreadnought's main sensor cluster. The massive array was protected by multiple shield generators and defensive weapons, but it was also a fixed target that couldn't maneuver away from her approach. The GAU-8 spoke again, its distinctive roar cutting through the silence of space as depleted uranium rounds shredded the sensor array. Explosions cascaded along the ship's hull as secondary systems overloaded, temporarily blinding the massive vessel. "Warthog lead, this is Fleet Admiral Torres. The main fleet is moving in for the attack. Whatever you're doing over there, keep doing it." Sarah glanced at her tactical display and grinned. The human battle fleet was emerging from hyperspace, their guns already trained on the confused Zephyrian formation. But more importantly, the alien ships were completely out of position to respond. Their perfect geometric formations had devolved into protective clusters around high-value targets, leaving them vulnerable to concentrated fire. "Copy that, Admiral. We'll keep them confused." She rolled into another seemingly suicidal approach toward the dreadnought's reactor section, knowing that the threat alone would force the entire enemy fleet to react. Around her, 11 other human pilots continued, their chaotic dance through enemy formations, each one a living reminder that humans didn't fight wars the way civilized species were supposed to. The Zephyrians had brought their best ships, their most advanced technology, their most experienced commanders. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd assumed their enemies would be rational. Sarah Chen and her squadron of flying tanks were about to teach them the difference between rational and human. The human fleet struck like a hammer against glass. Admiral Torres had timed the attack perfectly, waiting until the Zephyrian formation was completely disrupted before committing his heavy units to battle. Railgun rounds from human destroyers punched through alien shields that had been repositioned to protect against single fighter attacks, while missile salvos overwhelmed point defense systems that were tracking chaotically maneuvering. A-tense Sarah watched the battle unfold from her cockpit as she lined up another strafing run on a Zephyrian command cruiser. The alien ship was beautiful in its way, all flowing lines and integrated systems that spoke of centuries of refined engineering. But beauty didn't matter when 30mm rounds were chewing through your hull plating. "Warthog 7, I've got a problem," called Lieutenant Bishop. His voice was strained, and Sarah could see why on her tactical display. 3 Zephyrian interceptors had finally managed to corner him, their combined fire overwhelming his ability to maneuver out of the way. "On my way, 7, Sarah replied, abandoning her attack run to streak toward Bishop's position. But she wasn't the only one who'd heard the call. Lieutenant Park was already there, her A-10 dropping into the middle of the alien formation like a brick thrown into a flock of birds. The Zephyrian pilots, trained for elegant dogfighting, found themselves trying to avoid a human fighter that flew like it was armored enough to ram other aircraft, which, Sarah reflected, it pretty much was. Park's Gaiu-8 caught one interceptor center mass, the alien fighter disintegrating under the weight of fire. The other 2 broke off their attack on Bishop, but found themselves facing Sarah's approach from an unexpected angle. In their perfect formation flying, they'd positioned themselves exactly where human tactics said they would be. The engagement lasted 30 seconds. When it was over, 3 more Zephyrian fighters were expanding clouds of debris, and Bishop was limping home with his starboard engine smoking but still functional. "Thanks for the assist," Bishop called out. "That's what wingmen are for," Park replied. "Besides, these aliens still haven't figured out that we actually coordinate when it matters." She was right. The Zephyrians had become so focused on the apparent chaos of human tactics that they'd missed the underlying teamwork. Each A-10 pilot might be improvising their approach, but they were all working toward the same goals, covering each other when needed and striking as a unit when opportunities presented themselves. Sarah keyed her radio to the general frequency. "Attention Zephyrian fleet, this is Captain Chen again. Lesson 3. Just because we don't follow your rules doesn't mean we don't have rules of our own." The dreadnought was listing now, its massive bulk turning slowly as internal explosions cascaded through its systems. The human fleet's concentrated fire had overwhelmed its shields, and boarding parties were already cutting their way through the hull to secure critical systems. But it was the smaller engagements that told the real story. Throughout the battle space, Zephyrian fighters were withdrawing from combat, their pilots no longer willing to engage human aircraft in close-quarters fighting. The psychological impact of facing enemies who seemed genuinely unconcerned about their own survival was proving more devastating than any weapon. "Fleet Command, this is Warthog Lead," Sarah called out. "We're reading massive energy signatures from the remaining alien ships. Looks like they're preparing to withdraw." "Confirmed, Warthog Lead. Intelligence indicates the Zephyrian commander is requesting permission to retreat. Apparently they're classifying human fighters as unreasonable combatants." Sarah had to laugh at that. Unreasonable combatants. It was probably the most accurate description of human military tactics that anyone had ever come up with. "All Warthogs, form up on me," she ordered. "Let's give them something to remember us by." The 12 surviving A-10s came together in a loose formation, flying directly toward the retreating Zephyrian fleet. They made no aggressive moves, fired no weapons, just flew in a straight line toward ships that could have destroyed them all with a single salvo. The psychological effect was electric. The aliens, who had been conducting an orderly withdrawal, suddenly accelerated their departure. Ships that had been fighting moments before were now racing for the hyperspace jump points, desperate to put distance between themselves and the human fighters that had just spent an hour proving that superior technology meant nothing against opponents who refused to be intimidated. "This is Admiral Torres to all units. Stand down from combat operations. The enemy fleet is withdrawing from the system." Sarah pulled her A-10 into a gentle turn, heading back toward base as the last Zephyrian ships vanished into hyperspace. Around her, the debris field that had once been a perfect alien battle formation drifted silently, testament to what happened when an irresistible force met an immovable object. Except in this case, the humans had been both. "Warthog Lead, this is Fleet Intelligence," came a new voice over the comm. "We're intercepting Zephyrian military communications. They're requesting immediate tactical analysis of human fighter doctrine. Apparently their war college wants to understand how we coordinate such complex maneuvers without command structure." Sarah grinned. "Tell them we'll be happy to demonstrate again anytime they want to come back." As the squadron flew home through the debris field, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The Zephyrians had brought their best ships, their most advanced technology, their finest pilots. They'd had every advantage except the most important one. They'd never learned how to fight dirty. But humans had been fighting dirty since they'd first picked up sticks and stones. It was, she reflected, one of their most endearing qualities. The war was far from over, but today had established something important. The Zephyrian Empire had learned that humans couldn't be conquered by conventional means. Every engagement would now carry the risk of facing opponents who might just decide that ramming your flagship was a reasonable tactical option. Sarah looked back at the burning hulk of the dreadnought and smiled. Sometimes the best way to win a fight was to convince your enemy that you were crazy enough to do anything to avoid losing. And humans, as the Zephyrians were learning, were very good at being crazy when it mattered. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Chen stood in the briefing room of the newly constructed Kepler station, watching as alien delegates filed in for what would become known as the Treaty of Human Space. The Zephyrian representatives moved with their characteristic grace, but Sarah noticed something different in their bearing. Where once they'd projected casual superiority, now there was a wariness, a careful respect that hadn't been there before. Admiral Torres gestured to the holographic display showing current fleet positions throughout the sector. As you can see, both sides have maintained the agreed-upon ceasefire for the past 3 months. No incidents, no violations. The lead Zephyrian delegate, a tall being with crystalline features that caught the light like cut gems, spoke in carefully modulated tones. The Empire acknowledges that humanity has proven itself worthy of special consideration in our expansion protocols. Sarah had to suppress a smile. Special consideration? That was diplomatic language for, we're too scared to fight you properly. The negotiations had been surprisingly brief once the Zephyrians realized that humans weren't going to be absorbed into their empire like every other species they'd encountered. The turning point had come when Sarah's squadron, now officially designated as the Unreasonable Response Unit, had been deployed to 3 more battles with similar results. Each engagement had followed the same pattern. Zephyrian forces would deploy in perfect formations, humans would respond with chaotic improvisation, and alien commanders would find themselves dealing with tactical situations that their computers couldn't model. The psychological impact had spread throughout the Zephyrian military. Pilots were requesting transfers away from human space, and some battle groups had started refusing orders to engage human forces entirely. Dr. Price, who had become something of an expert on Zephyrian military psychology, leaned forward in her chair. What the Empire is really saying is that they've never encountered a species that treats warfare as a form of creative expression rather than mathematical optimization. The Zephyrian delegates' crystalline features shifted in what might have been irritation. Human tactical doctrine is difficult to categorize. Your commanders make decisions that appear suboptimal, yet consistently achieve favorable outcomes. That's because you're still thinking like Zephyrians, Sarah interjected. You see chaos where we see opportunity. You calculate odds where we see challenges to overcome. She stood and walked to the display, highlighting the locations where her squadron had engaged alien forces. Every one of these battles was supposed to be impossible for us to win. Superior numbers, better technology, more experienced pilots. But you made one crucial mistake. Which was? The delegate asked. You assumed we cared about the odds. The room fell silent. The Zephyrian delegation exchanged what Sarah had learned to recognize as their equivalent of nervous glances. Crystalline features flickering with subtle color changes that indicated emotional stress. Admiral Torres pulled up a tactical analysis that had been compiled over the past months. The Empire's military doctrine is based on mathematical certainty. You calculate optimal outcomes and execute perfect strategies. But humans have never fought that way. We fight like we're already dead, Sarah added quietly. Every pilot who climbs into a cockpit knows they might not come back. Once you accept that, everything else becomes negotiable. The lead delegate's colors shifted to deeper hues. This is disturbing to contemplate. How does your species maintain unit cohesion when individual survival is not prioritized? Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been promoted after the Dreadnought battle, stood up. Because we're not fighting for individual survival. We're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. He activated another display showing human colonial settlements across the contested systems. Every depot we destroy, every supply convoy we hit, every time we make your forces hesitate, we're protecting families. Children who are learning to walk on alien worlds their parents died to claim. Sarah nodded. You see our tactics as irrational because you don't understand what we're really fighting for. It's not territory or resources or strategic advantage. We're fighting for the right to exist on our own terms. The Zephyrian delegate was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. The Empire has encountered many species in our expansion. Some resist initially, but they eventually accept integration once they understand the benefits of joining our civilization. And that's why you'll never understand humans, Sarah replied. We'd rather die free than live as someone else's subjects. That's not a tactical doctrine you can teach or a strategy you can counter. It's who we are, Dr. Price added her analysis. The psychological profiles we've developed show that Zephyrian military effectiveness drops significantly when facing opponents who demonstrate genuine disregard for personal safety. Your pilots are trained to be professionals, not martyrs. While our pilots, Sarah continued, are trained to complete the mission regardless of cost. That A-10 you saw me fly into your dreadnought's formation, it was designed by people who understood that sometimes you have to get close enough to the enemy to shake hands before you kill them. The alien delegate's colors shifted again. The Empire wishes to propose a formal recognition of human territorial claims in exchange for a non-aggression pact. We will establish a buffer zone between our species to prevent future conflicts. Sarah exchanged glances with Admiral Torres. This was more than they'd hoped for when the war started. The Zephyrians weren't just offering peace. They were offering to leave humanity alone entirely. There's one more thing, Sarah said, walking back to her seat. The Empire needs to understand that this isn't just about us. Any species you encounter from now on might have learned our lessons. The galaxy is full of civilizations that could develop their own versions of unreasonable tactics. What are you suggesting? The delegate asked. Maybe it's time for the Empire to consider that expansion through conquest isn't the only way to grow. Maybe there's something to be said for voluntary cooperation between equals. The Zephyrian delegation conferred among themselves in rapid musical tones that the translators couldn't keep up with. Finally, the lead delegate turned back to the humans. The Empire will consider these perspectives. In the meantime, we accept the proposed territorial boundaries and non-aggression terms. As the formal ceremonies concluded and documents were signed, Sarah found herself standing at the observation deck, watching the Zephyrian ships prepare for departure. Their formations were as perfect as ever, elegant and precise as they moved away from human space. Admiral Torres joined her at the viewport. Think they'll actually learn from this? Sarah watched the last alien ship vanish into hyperspace. Maybe. Or maybe they'll find someone else who's willing to fight by their rules. And if they don't? Sarah smiled, thinking of the other A-10 squadrons that were being formed, crewed by pilots who had studied the battle recordings and wanted their own. Chance to show an overconfident empire what humans could do with outdated equipment and unlimited stubbornness. Then they'll keep running into species that learned the most. Important lesson we have to teach. Sometimes, the best weapon against superior technology is the willingness to do whatever it takes to win. She looked back at the briefing room where the treaty documents lay signed and sealed. The war was over, but the legend was just beginning. Across human space, pilots were already painting kill marks on their aircraft and learning to fly like their lives didn't matter as much as their mission. The Zephyrians had brought down her Warthog exactly 0 times. And now every pilot in the fleet knew that tail number 810650 belonged to the woman who had made an entire empire blink first. The sight of her tail number would leave F-16 pilots speechless for generations, not because of the aircraft itself, but because of what it represented. The moment humanity announced to the galaxy that they would fight their own way, win their own victories, and never, ever surrender to anyone who thought superior technology was a substitute for superior will. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, full of possibilities and new challenges. Sarah smiled and headed back to the flight line. Somewhere out there, other empires were watching and learning, and her A-10 was still loaded and ready for whatever came next.